Globalization has been underway for centuries, and if Europe and the United States led the way in the 19th and 20th centuries, geopolitical strategist Parag Khanna says Asia will lead the next phase. He makes that case in his new book, The Future is Asian, and Parag Khanna joins us now. Hi, it's nice to meet you.
You too.
You've been on the show before and you've spoken to Steve, so it's nice to get a chance to talk to you.
Indeed.
This book is super informative. So many things that I didn't know, so many layers to it. So you write in the book, you describe the Asianization of Asia.
Yes.
What does that mean?
That means that after 500 years of colonialism and the Cold War, if you think about it, from the 16th century onwards, Europe was colonized by Europeans, then it was fragmented in the through Cold War geopolitics. It's been 500 years since Asians had more to do with each other than with their colonial masters. So since the end of the Cold War, which is almost 30 years ago, you've had this process of reintegration. People call it the New Silk Roads. So the New Silk Roads have been forming for about 30 years. And that is what I mean by the Asianization of Asia. Asians rediscovering each other. And they've already become more than 40% of the global economy. They already trade more with each other than they do with the rest of the world. So in fact, it's already the case that Asia has come back together into what I call a system. And I think it's just our mentality, whether we're in the West or even in Asia itself, where there's a lot of ignorance about how far Asia has already come.
But even in the book, you say some countries are part of Asia, countries that we normally probably would be like, no, that can't be right. But you say that countries like New Zealand and Australia are part of Asia?
So here's the thing. There's only one correct definition of Asia, right? And it is the definition that I use. And it's not my definition. It is a geographer's understanding of Asia, which is from the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea, meaning Israel, Lebanon, even Russia, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries, all the way to Japan. And Russia, most of Russia, all the way, yes, to Australia. That is the only correct definition of Asia, and all I'm doing is using it. But of course, in the last 20 years, we've had lots of books about Asia. However, if you read them all, which is my job to do, they're basically just about China. And Japan gets a couple of pages, and India gets a couple of pages. So what's been missing, and what I've been seeking to correct, is to write a book that is properly about this full Asian system. Now, China is a huge part of that Asian system. A lot of my previous books, and probably more than a third, if not a half of this book, are in fact about China. But China is not an island floating over the world, or even Asia. It's deeply embedded in this Asian system, and understanding how China depends on other Asians, and indeed how other Asians are now coming out of China's shadow. Faster growing economies, younger populations, in the case of India, an even larger population than China within 10 years from now. That story also needs to be told alongside China.
You do mention that China is 1.5 billion of the 5 billion people in Asia. We'll talk about China more, because we have to. But I wanted to go back to this idea of these countries that are part of what you say is Asia. And you kept saying the quotation, right? So you're talking about, this is like a huge region. It's almost half the planet. So what would connect people in the West, say like in Israel, Afghanistan, Yemen, to people in the East, say in China, Thailand, Japan, and then south to Australia and New Zealand?
Right. So again, it is the fact that they all, again, and a lot of people in their own countries may not even realize it. If you take countries like Russia or Turkey or Israel or Saudi Arabia, right? These are the Western, the geographic Western fringes, Northwestern fringes, and Southwestern fringes of Asia. They have, for going back 20 years, branded themselves as Western, wanting to lean to the West, wanting to be part of Western institutions, NATO, the European Union, and so forth. About 10 years ago, these countries all realized, in their own way, for their own reasons, that, well, the West makes demands of us that we don't want to fulfill. We want to have our own identity. And they all went through this phase of just wanting to be independent. In Turkey, we call it the kind of neo-Ottoman phase, you know, where they kind of cooled on the European Union, but they hadn't yet discovered the Asian opportunity. That's the phase that all of those countries are in now, where economically they're more tied to Asia than they are to the West. So Russia used to have Germany as its largest trading partner. Now China is its largest trading partner. Turkey is definitely never going to join the European Union, the way things are going diplomatically. But it has joined China's Belt and Road Initiative, right? And Saudi Arabia now sells almost all of its oil and gas east across the Indian Ocean to South Korea, Japan, China, and India, right? So all of these countries have Asianized in a very big way. Again, they were always geographically Asian. Let there be no mistake. Their geology has not shifted in a couple of decades, right? Now they're more economically Asian. And what follows from that is that they become more strategically Asian as well. And that's what we see happening in the Russia-China relationship, for example.
I want to talk more about the Belt Road Initiative. But I also, you know, you're talking about the geography.
Right.
But where does identity come into play? Because I think if you're in Russia, Russians are very proud of their European heritage, of their white heritage.
Right.
How would they respond to be considered as part of Asia?
Yeah. Now, I've been writing about the Asianization of Russia for a long time, and that's the title of a whole chapter of this book around it. And I explain, you know, and this is kind of a takeaway punchline, is Russia's demographics don't exactly resemble its ice hockey team, right? And it kind of, what the view you just gave was the ice hockey team view, which is that, well, Russians are these white Caucasians that think of themselves as Europeans, and the orientation of the country was set back by Peter the Great, you know, centuries ago, and again, the countries inexorably marching towards Europe. But in fact, it has a very diverse complexion. The fastest growing population segment is Muslims of Central Asian and Turkic extraction in what is the country with the fastest declining overall population. So in other words, the percentage of non-Caucasians is growing very rapidly. And again, the immigration is happening from Central Asia and other Asian countries, their trade relations, the new migration patterns, because they are actually frozen out of easy migration from the West, right? They will never be given free visa mobility to Europe. It's in fact one of the key diplomatic levers that Europe holds against Russia. Meanwhile, Asian countries are saying, come, Russians, come and do business and trade here and so forth. So identity is not this fixed thing that's set by one segment of the population. And for sure, Canada can relate to that statement, right? And Australia too, by the way. And the chapters in Australia that I have in the book also get into this idea that, you know, is Australia always going to have just one fixed identity, that they are sort of, you know, Europeans that simply live in the greater Asian geography? No, because you can see in Australia too, by far the largest influx of foreigners is Asians, right? From various countries, not just China, but also Japan, India, and elsewhere.
So you're saying that some of the countries don't necessarily have to be on board with this idea of the future of Asia?
In a way, this Asianization is happening in countries all over the world. It could just be that more kids are learning Chinese in school. It could be that you're going to yoga classes. It could be that your country is completely hitched economically to China, the way Australia is. It could be that you have decided to have a military partnership or alliance with with China, the way some African countries have. Or Indian workers are now doing your telecommunication systems and your textile factories. That any one of those things, or all of them, is happening in dozens and dozens, if not every country in the world in some way, shape, or form. The way I like to put it is at a personal, human level, is that everyone knows how European they are, right? Sort of, you know, did your parents go study there? Did you learn a European language? What's your favorite Premier Club football team? Everyone knows in some way how, right, there you go. Yeah. Everyone knows how American they are in some way, right? Your favorite Hollywood actor or where you studied, something like that, right? With the influence of America on your country. In whatever corner of the world, there is some American influence, right? We're just starting to be able to answer the question, how Asian are you, right? And it could be little things and it could be really big things, right? But it is happening everywhere.
Well, in Europe, Europe has Christianity in common. Is there a similar glue holding Asian countries together?
It's a great question, and no. And so again, Asia is very different. Asia is by far the biggest, you know, most diverse, most populous region of the world. It has 4,000 years of distinct civilizational histories, you know, about a half dozen or more major civilizations. So you will never have a common religion, you'll never have a common language, you'll never have a common currency, a common parliament. That doesn't mean that Asia is not Asianizing. Asia can Asianize in its own way. It doesn't have to do it the European way. It doesn't have to do it the North American way. It will do it its own way. And I explore that from the inside out, which means their trade complementarities, their free trade agreements, the labor mobility agreements between the countries. You've got young Asians moving into aging Asian countries like Japan, South Korea, China, have never had more Pakistanis, Indonesians, Filipinos, and even Africans moving into their countries to fill labor shortages. Japan has never had 2 million foreigners in Japan. So that doesn't make it a melting pot by Canadian standards, right? But it is a whole new degree of engagement socially with each other than they've had in many, many centuries. And it's actually happening also most pronouncedly in these kind of melting pot cities like Hong Kong and Singapore, for example.
And you also write that there are a lot of people coming from the West and they're going to
Yes.
Asian countries.
Yeah.
They might go there to teach or study, but then they decide to stay.
Yes.
How different will an Asian world order be from the American-led world order?
It is really interesting. Well, so on the macro point, it's not that the Asian-led world order means that there is no more Western influence. You know, in my work, I always emphasize that we're heading into an unprecedented era where you have multiple powers from different regions and cultures and histories that are important at the same time. In previous eras where you had, you know, one superpower or multiple powers, they were Western powers, basically, right? So this is the first time in history where you have the United States being a superpower, Europe is a key global power economically and diplomatically, and within Asia you have China, India, Japan, Russia, Australia, Korea. Again, the world has 8, 9 significant powers, right? Some are greater and more powerful than others, of course, but we have to put on a different frame. We tend to ask this question, which is, who's number one? If it's not going to be America, then it therefore is China. What if it's all of the above, right? And that's the way the world actually looks today. So if you start with the wrong question, which is who's number one, you're going to come out with the wrong answer, right? So Asia is taking its rightful place. It's not leading the world in the sense of replacing everyone else. History is not this blank slate.
But if you were to ask Americans who's number one, they will say, we're number one. So in this future Asianization, if I can actually say the word, how do you imagine the West will be affected if they're not number one?
Well, again, you have multiple number ones, so let's all just take comfort in that and kind of move beyond that question. So America is, again, still a superpower. It's one of the world's largest economies. It has tremendous military and diplomatic, strategic, and economic influence all over the world. But no American would dispute the fact that its relative share of the world economy is obviously in decline, given the rise of Asia. That's not something that we can debate. It's just a fact, right? And that their military can no longer call the shots everywhere. I served in Iraq and Afghanistan, so I know quite well how difficult it is for military power in a latent way to translate into influence on the ground, right? It's certainly true in East Asia, where you have nuclear powers, very, million-man armies, and huge defense expenditures, right? So America can't just get its way strategically either. So Americans love it or hate it, are getting used to the fact that it is a multipolar world and that Asia is going to decide on its own what it's going to do. And the Belt and Road Initiative is a very good example of this. And the regional
What is that? Let's talk about that. What is that?
So the Belt and Road Initiative is originated in China, but it immediately had dozens of Asian countries on board. And it is the world's largest, most coordinated infrastructure investment plan. Some would say it's like the Marshall Plan, only it's probably 50 times bigger, right? And you're talking about, again, billions of people who are coordinating across 30, 40 countries, major infrastructure projects,
America's not part of it, though, right?
No. And it's a matter of some debate because, again, America cannot influence what China and its neighbors are doing if they agree to do it on their own, with their own rules and on their own terms. And that's what's happening. So we're witnessing with the number of trade agreements, like the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is for Asians, by Asians, among Asians. And the Belt and Road Initiative is like, wow, Asians can make their own decisions. We didn't think that they could, right? We tend to think of others, even Europeans, as basically strategically inert and incapable of deciding for themselves what is best for them. I've got news for you, right? Others are quite competent, right, and quite capable. And the Belt and Road Initiative proves that. And the U.S. has in the last couple of years formally opposed other countries joining it and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is another Asian-centric, China-led development finance institution. But all countries joined it anyway, right? Because it's good for their own interests.
I have to, it sounds like a positive future, but there are some things that people take issue with, China, the authoritarian state.
Right.
And most of the world's civil unrest lies in this area that you're talking about. And you actually write, war is as much a part of the system as trade or diplomacy. What do you mean by that?
Well, if you look at Asia, it is definitely not all rosy at all. The largest populations in the world that are exposed to climate change and resource stress are in Asia. Most of the world's geopolitical fault lines and World War III scenarios, which I concoct like for a living, what could go wrong? And the book is full of them, are in Asia. Could be North Korea, China, Japan, China, India, South China Sea, Iran, India, Pakistan. The region is riddled with disputes, no question about it. And yet, we have to, again, be very clear that in the last 30 years, since the fall of the Soviet Union, Asians have been pretty good at keeping their geopolitical disputes and tensions at bay while achieving a spectacular degree of economic integration and mutual benefit. And they show pretty, again, positive signs of being able to manage those tensions. And I want to give credit to the fact that actually America plays an important role in helping to keep a lid on some of those disputes. No doubt about it. There is a global role in keeping Asia stable. But Asians also have done a good job of again, managing their passions, if you will, and tensions. So
what about democracy?
Then there's that issue. Now, I want to be clear about this, because Asia, as we discussed earlier, is 4.5 billion people, and China is only 1/3 of that. So for the record, there are more people, more human beings who live in democracies in Asia than the rest of the planet Earth, right? Just, I could repeat it if you like, right? India, Indonesia, the Philippines, those 3 countries, that's like 1.7 billion people right there. Even Thailand is coming out of a military regime having an election this year. Not to mention Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Australia, New Zealand. In the greater Asian space, obviously in some of these countries for historical reasons and certainly due to the legacy of British colonialism or American occupation, Asia has some of the foremost democracies in the world, right? Some of the most top-ranked democracies in the world, like Australia and New Zealand.
But China is a huge part of that, though.
So China is China, and there are 1.5 billion people in China who live under an authoritarian regime. But there's more than 2 billion people in Asia who do not live under Chinese authoritarianism, and they exist. They are real. Their stories matter. Their democracies are real. So when we talk about Asia, we so often paint it as this hegemonic, authoritarian, monolithic force from the East led by China. I don't know any citizen of Asia outside of China who wants to live under Chinese authoritarianism. I know lots of Chinese who don't want to live under Chinese authoritarianism. So I do not worry, and I live in Asia, I do not worry, I do not lose a minute's sleep that Chinese authoritarianism is spreading and dominating Asia and turning what are lively, democratic, vibrant cultures into non-democracies.
I'm getting the sense,
right?
even in the book, you do say that the West is too focused on China.
Yeah.
How does this manifest itself?
Well, it's certainly, look at the U.S.-China trade war. You know, there's a belief that the U.S. and China are the 2 most powerful forces shaping, the world economy, and that the fate of the world economy and even geopolitics hinges on whether or not Donald Trump and Xi Jinping and their negotiators can come to an agreement by the end of February this year. That's not true. Right. Europe represents the largest proportion of global trade, about 38%, more than Asia, including China, and way more than the United States, because the U.S. and North America, including Canada, are the most autarkic region of the world, actually. So the U.S. is much less significant in world trade than it is in terms of its economic size. So in fact, there's multiple players in the trade war, and what we're missing when we talk about just the U.S.-China is that there are other regions of the world winning from the trade war that are neither the U.S. nor China. And I live in one of those regions, Southeast
Singapore,
Asia, right? Southeast Asia has 750 million people, which is nothing to sneeze at. It's larger than the entire population of the European Union. It's one of the fastest growing economic regions of the world. It has a larger GDP than India, and to the extent we're not talking about China, we're often talking about India, but the GDP of just ASEAN, Southeast Asia, is bigger than India's GDP. That little region of ASEAN gets more foreign investment than China does, and the amount of investment it's receiving is growing and accelerating because of the trade war, right? So if we neglect to talk about the other parts of Asia, we actually forget that those regions are winning from the trade war, and they should become an even bigger part of the story even faster than they are. And that's just one example.
Well, we've run out of time. In the book, you argue that, well, we all know what's happening around the world. It seems like Western countries are pulling back from globalization by closing their borders. But you argue that in Asia, it's different. Borders are actually being opened.
Yes.
In what way?
Yeah. So I mentioned earlier the demographic flows about young Asians moving into aging Asian countries. So there are millions and millions and millions of Asians circulating amongst each other's countries. All Asian countries are bringing down visa restrictions, right? They want more tourists. So many developing countries, whether it's Thailand or Malaysia or others, have these new investor residency schemes or entrepreneur schemes. Come, young millennials of the West, here's 5 years, come and live, start a company, hire some locals, bring your knowledge and talent, and just show up. right? That's opening borders, right? And so whereas millions of people in the West live in countries where borders may be, quote unquote, closing, billions of people live in Asian countries where the opposite is happening. So whether we're thinking about xenophobia or populism or trade protectionism, let's remember that that's a very narrow conversation that applies to a few countries that are probably making really bad choices for their future, like the UK and the US, does not apply to Asia, right, where the governments are a lot more pragmatic, quite frankly, and are doing the right things by opening and opening further.
Well, what should people in the West do to prepare for Asia's power in the future?
Well, there is really no longer such a thing as a coherent, united West. When I think of Canada, for example, I think of a country that's a lot more like Western Europe than it is like the United States in terms of your political economy and your welfare system and so forth. I think of America and the UK being in a different sort of camp at this point. So, one of the things I go to great lengths to point out and document in the book is my chapter about Europe. And I say Europe, which really represents the West as much as any other part of the West, is really leaning heavily towards Asia, right? The European Union trades with Asia $1.6 trillion a year. That's $500 billion a year more than it trades with the US.
That's a lot of money.
That's a lot of money, and it really shows that Europe, which we completely ignore because they may not be articulating their position well in the English language on the BBC or TVO, but we don't listen to what Germans and French and Italians and Spanish are doing, but I'll tell you what they're doing. They're actually leaning very heavily towards Asia because it suits their economic interests, it creates jobs for them, it boosts their exports. And yes, they have to deal with the challenges of the value systems clashing, especially when they deal with China. But they have strong positions on that. The German government is no less tough in criticizing China than other Western governments are. But we should pay attention to that because they engage and challenge at the same time, rather than retreating and pulling back the way the U.S. has done with the TPP trade agreement, the comprehensive trade agreement that Canada and Mexico very wisely joined and the U.S. didn't. So I think that there is no one Western answer. There's what smart Western countries are doing. And I would look at Germany, Canada, and other countries as being on the smart side of what Western powers can do to engage productively and constructively with this rising Asia.
And with less than a minute to go, will the West resist an Asian world order?
It's not about resisting, right? You can't, it's sort of like gravity, right? When you have 5 billion people, the majority of the world's population for the next generations to come, growing together rapidly, representing the majority of the world's economic growth, largest export markets, there's no question that Asia is going to rise no matter what you do or would seek to prevent. It's going to happen, right? The question is, how do you adapt to it and share the stage and benefit from it, right? Again, Canada benefits from growing trade with China. It benefits from talented migrants coming from Asia, right? And that's what Western countries should do, is to adapt in a way that benefits them, rather than resisting something that shouldn't be resisted just for the sake of resisting it. And that's kind of what one hears from Washington very often. I don't think that those are footsteps you want to follow in.
So collaboration is key.
Absolutely.
I have so many more questions to ask, but we've run out of time. Parag, thank you so much. This book is so informative. I've learned so much. Thank you for making the time to be on TVO.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.